Hey everybody, welcome to this edition of Creating the Image. My name is Alec Johnson. Thanks so much for joining me. In this first part of a two-part series, I'm going to talk about a studio portrait lighting setup that I use on occasion to light a number of my clients. This is a 5-light setup, and it's one I demonstrated recently at a workshop in Knoxville, Tennessee. So let's go ahead and get started.
Another dream about lions at the door. They weren't half as frightening as they were before, but I'm thinking about eternity.
All right, here is our model. His name is Terry. He is a professional model, and he's also a kickboxer. And you can see the lighting here on Terry. I'm going to point out the lights real quick. This is a 5-light setup, as I said earlier, and by most accounts, people would consider this a fairly complicated lighting setup, though it is not unusual. It's not unusual actually to use up to 7 lights to do this kind of cinematic lighting. And the reason some of us would choose to do this is because of the enormous amount of physical depth and dimension, the modeling that this light gives to our subject. And what exactly does that mean? Well, what it means is that there's a lot of movement on the subject between bright and dark areas. So there's a transition, and transitions from bright to bright in the hair, and transitions from dark to dark between the background and the subject matter, and transitions here between dark tones to light tones to dark tones across the forehead. This all tends to create more depth and more physical dimension and visual depth in our subject matter, gives our subject character, makes them jump off the page a bit. That's what the lighting setup does. The downside to a complicated lighting setup like this, especially where these lights are hitting on the side of Terry's head, the downside is you wouldn't necessarily use this for a fashion shoot, because in a fashion shoot we want a little more flexibility and fluidness in posing our subject. In this setup, we're shooting a portrait and we're controlling the posing of our subject to a high degree. There is flexibility, but it's relatively limited. So there is some downside to this, but it can be a really great lighting setup for the right subject. So I want to go ahead now and pull in our lighting diagram. We also have a photo of the setup during the demonstration, and I also brought Terry's picture back in here again. So let me go ahead and point out these lights. The first ones I want to talk about are on the side of Terry's face here. They're coming in from the left and right of the camera. They're called rim lights, and they're noted here on our diagram. The rim lights I'm using here, all my lights are Alien Bs, and in these monoblocks, I'm using 30-degree spot grids, 30-degree spot grids in those, and that's giving me a fairly strong spotlight, a narrow beam of light that you can see come in here and hit Terry on the side of the face. It is a bit of a trick to get these to hit where you want them and to have them avoid hitting where you don't want them. It's easy for this light to slip through and hit your subject in the nose in odd ways. So you have to be careful with that. It takes a little practice. Also, I want to say that you could experiment with these rim lights and use a strip box, which is a narrow soft box like you see up here. You might use a bigger softbox. You're going to get a different effect, and the larger your light source becomes with a softbox and a softer light, you're going to start losing this really nice, clean masking of the front of the face that we get. All right, so those are the rim lights. We have a background light right here, and that lights and creates the halo on the background here that you can see in the image. So that background light's hitting right there. Then we have, I guess, what I would call a key light, which is our beauty dish in this case. So we have a beauty dish on an Alien B's monoblock. You could use a beauty dish, you could use a big softbox, you could use a ring light. All are going to give you a slightly different effect. All are equally good, none are bad, just different. I happen to have a beauty dish at my disposal at this time, so that's what I went with. And it's what I actually use in the studio for this shot. So that worked out just fine. And then our 5th light is the hair light. And this I used a strip box. This makes a really nice hair light. But again, you have options here as well. You could use a ring light up here to light your subject on the top, or a strobe with a spot grid in them, like we're using to light with the rim lights. Either way, or a big square softbox, it doesn't matter. Just need to control and pay attention to where that light is hitting your subject. So in this case, and you can see a little bit in here, that I tend to place the strip box to the rear of the head and shining at an angle back across the top of the head ever so slightly. It's not shooting straight down, but it's kind of coming from back to front in this direction slightly. And that tends to make a real nice light on our subject, excuse me. Okay, so that's the lighting diagram set up. And then the last part you need to think about with this is the lighting ratios. And so what are they? I'm not really sure. Some people are quite technical on managing their lighting ratios. I know my gear and I know where I shoot at, and so my process is to first establish an exposure for the background the way I want it. And that means having the angle of ascent of the light pointing up at the background correct, and how it spreads out when it hits the background, and also having the right exposure on it. In this case, I was probably slightly underexposed for what I would normally like, but that was okay, and maybe slightly low. Look, the light was maybe sitting slightly low. And so, you know, you can't really see the light back here, but it's behind me. But I would have maybe liked to broad it up just a little bit and had it point at a little bit less severe of an angle instead of coming and hitting up like that. Might have made that change. But first I get the background light adjusted where I want it. Then I go to work and actually meter my softbox, my key light for my camera exposures settings. And then I bring in rim light and hair light to taste. You guys hear me loud and clear, to taste. However you want it. There's no correct ratio or exposure setting for this. I definitely, my taste tends to push it right to the edge of blowing out the skin. And here I like a modest hair light, not over or underexposed. So quite often this exposure, if I have my lights set up right for the hair, is very close, and my light setting is very close to what I'm shooting on the face with my softbox. My tendency is for the ratios here, or the ratio here between the rim light and the key light, to be upwards of +2 or more stops difference. So there it is, the 5-light studio setup. A little bit of work in getting them positioned right, getting the exposures and ratios right. But once you do, you're going to have a beautiful lighting setup that creates an enormous amount of depth. It's very unique looking. It's difficult to do, and so a lot of people don't like necessarily to do it. It's not for every subject. And then that concludes this tutorial, this first part of this tutorial. In the second part, I'm going to go through the Photoshop editing of this particular image. Thanks so much for joining me.